Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button right now.
The St. Louis Cardinals just pulled off one of the most controversial moves in franchise history, and the baseball world is absolutely losing its mind trying to figure out whether this is genius-level strategy or organizational suicide. We're talking about the Nolan Arenado trade that has fans divided, analysts confused, and rival teams circling like sharks who smell blood in the water. But here's the thing that nobody's talking about, the thing that might actually change your entire perspective on what's happening in St. Louis right now. The ownership group that Cardinals fans have been roasting mercilessly for the past 2 years might actually deserve some credit for what they're pulling off behind the scenes. I know that sounds crazy. I know you're probably thinking this channel has lost its mind, but stick with me because the evidence is mounting that something fundamentally different is happening with this franchise, and it could determine whether the Cardinals dominate baseball for the next decade or fade into mediocrity. Let's start with the absolute circus surrounding the Nolan Arenado situation, because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. The Cardinals finally moved their former superstar third baseman to the Arizona Diamondbacks in a deal that, on the surface, looks like highway robbery, except the Cardinals are the ones getting robbed. Arizona essentially acquired a Platinum Glove winner, a former MVP candidate, and one of the best offensive third basemen of his generation for what baseball insiders are jokingly calling a warm ham sandwich. The prospect return was minimal, the financial relief was limited, and Cardinals fans were ready to storm the front office with pitchforks demanding answers about how this could possibly represent smart organizational decision-making. But then the details started emerging, the behind-the-scenes information that changes the entire narrative, and suddenly this trade starts looking less like incompetence and more like the only realistic option in a market that had completely collapsed for Arenado's services. Ken Rosenthal, one of baseball's most respected insiders, dropped a bombshell report revealing that the San Diego Padres had been in serious discussions to acquire Arenado, except they wanted him to play first base instead of third, and they were only willing to take him if the Cardinals covered virtually his entire contract, meaning San Diego would pay basically league minimum salary for a player still owed tens of millions of dollars. Think about how absolutely wild that is for a second. The Padres, a team that's shown willingness to spend enormous amounts of money on star players, a franchise that handed out massive contracts to guys like Manny Machado and Xander Bogaerts, looked at Nolan Arenado and essentially said, we'll take him off your hands if you pay us to do it. They didn't even value his defensive prowess enough to play him at his natural position, instead planning to stick him at first base where his glove work would be less impactful. This wasn't the Cardinals' front office fumbling negotiations or forgetting to ask for proper compensation. This was the market speaking loudly and clearly about Arenado's current value around the league. The fact that it took 15 months to find a trade partner for Arenado tells you everything you need to know about how other teams viewed his contract, his age, his declining production, and his fit within their organizational structures. General Manager Chaim Bloom wasn't sitting in negotiation rooms getting fleeced by smarter executives. He was dealing with a reality where contending teams didn't want to absorb the financial commitment required to acquire Arenado, where rebuilding teams had no use for an aging star on an expensive deal, and where Arenado's no-trade clause limited potential destinations to begin with. The Diamondbacks deal, as underwhelming as it appears, might actually represent Bloom extracting maximum value from an impossibly difficult situation. Cardinals fans have spent weeks, months really, complaining that the return for Arenado was pathetic, that ownership should have eaten more salary to acquire better prospects, that this trade represents organizational failure at the highest levels. But the Padres situation reveals that the Diamondbacks deal was actually better than available alternatives, that Arizona taking on more salary than San Diego was willing to consider actually represents a minor victory in negotiations, and that Bloom avoided accepting the absolute worst-case scenario offers that were apparently floating around the trade market. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because with Arenado finally off the roster, the Cardinals can focus their full attention on the next domino that's absolutely certain to fall, and that domino is named Brendan Donovan. If you've been following Cardinals baseball even casually, you know that Donovan has been mentioned in trade rumors constantly, that multiple contending teams are aggressively pursuing his services, and that his positional versatility combined with team control makes him one of the most attractive trade chips available anywhere in baseball right now. Mark Feinsand, one of Major League Baseball's premier national reporters, just published a comprehensive article examining Donovan's trade market, and the language he used was absolutely striking. He called Donovan a near lock to be traded, suggesting that the question isn't whether the Cardinals move him, but rather when and to which team. The San Francisco Giants are reportedly pursuing Donovan aggressively, desperately needing an upgrade at second base, and viewing Donovan's ability to also play outfield as an added bonus that makes him more valuable than other available options. The Giants aren't alone in their interest. The Seattle Mariners, the Boston Red Sox, and potentially other contenders are all circling, all making inquiries, all trying to figure out what it would take to pry Donovan away from St. Louis. And here's the critical factor that Cardinals fans need to understand. The Arenado trade actually strengthens the team's negotiating position for Donovan because they no longer face urgent pressure to clear roster space for incoming prospects like J.J. Weatherholt. They've already done the hard part, the painful part, the part that involved eating salary and accepting minimal returns. Everything else is gravy. Beat reporters from around the league are publishing analysis about why their respective teams should target Donovan, breaking down his statistical profile, his defensive versatility, his remaining years of team control, and his relatively affordable salary compared to other available second basemen. Maria Guardado, who covers the Giants for MLB.com, specifically noted that Donovan might be more attractive than Nico Herner, the Cubs second baseman, who's also been mentioned in trade speculation, because Donovan has an extra year of control and can play multiple positions, including outfield, where San Francisco also needs help. This positional flexibility is absolutely crucial to understanding Donovan's trade value. He won a Gold Glove as a utility player, demonstrating elite defensive ability at multiple spots around the diamond, giving acquiring teams roster construction flexibility that single-position players simply can't provide. For teams like the Giants, who have needs at both second base and outfield, Donovan represents a potential solution to multiple problems, which naturally drives up his price in trade negotiations. Daniel Kramer, who covers the Mariners, revealed that Seattle had engaged in trade discussions with the Cardinals earlier this offseason, but that St. Louis was more motivated at that time to move their expensive veteran pieces like Arenado. Now that those trades are complete, Kramer suggests that conversations around Donovan could accelerate quickly because Bloom can focus his full attention on maximizing return rather than juggling multiple simultaneous negotiations. This brings us to the really controversial part, the part where I'm probably going to get roasted in the comments, but needs to be said anyway. The DeWitt ownership group might actually deserve more credit and respect than Cardinals fans have been willing to give them recently. I know that sounds insane. I know the DeWitts made themselves incredibly unpopular with tone-deaf comments about attendance and payroll, essentially blaming fans for the team's struggles and suggesting that lower attendance would force lower spending, which is exactly backward from how these things should work. But look at what they've actually done here, at the financial commitment they've made to rebuilding this franchise the right way. The Cardinals ownership has willingly absorbed $54 million in salary obligations for players who will not wear the birds on the bat over the next 2 years. $54 million. That's not pocket change. That's not a rounding error. That's a massive financial commitment to ensuring that the rebuild happens properly, that trades focus on acquiring talent rather than simply dumping salary, and that the organization emerges from this transition period positioned for sustained success. So many ownership groups around baseball would have taken the cheap route, would have told their front office to slash payroll at all costs, would have prioritized short-term financial savings over long-term competitive positioning. If the DeWitts had adopted that approach, the Cardinals would have gotten absolutely nothing for Wilson Contreras, would have been begging teams to take Sonny Gray off their hands, and would have needed to attach premium prospects just to move Arenado's contract. Instead, by demonstrating willingness to eat salary, they enabled Bloom to actually acquire assets in return to bring back prospects who are now populating the organization's top 10 rankings and to build a farm system that finally looks capable of producing the next generation of Cardinals stars. This represents a fundamental philosophical shift from the Mozeliak era, when the front office seemed allergic to any hint of rebuilding, when the strategy was always to patch holes with veteran acquisitions and chase wild card spots rather than committing to comprehensive roster reconstruction. John Mozeliak, who served the organization with distinction for many years, simply wasn't willing to embrace a full teardown and rebuild. He believed in staying competitive, in maintaining respectability, and avoiding the kind of painful transition period that alienates fans and creates years of losing baseball. But that approach had run its course. The roster had become disjointed, the farm system had been depleted, and the team was stuck in mediocrity without a clear path forward. Getting Mozeliak to step aside and bringing in Chaim Bloom represented ownership's acknowledgement that dramatic change was necessary, that the old methods weren't working anymore, and that short-term pain might be required to create long-term success. Bloom has a track record of building sustainable winner through player development and smart trades, and the DeWitts are giving him the financial resources necessary to execute that vision properly. The $54 million investment in salary absorption is the clearest possible signal that ownership is committed to doing this rebuild correctly. They're not cutting corners. They're not prioritizing profit margins over competitive success. They're accepting significant financial losses in the short term with the expectation that proper roster construction will lead to championships and increased revenue in the future. That's exactly the kind of ownership mentality that Cardinals fans should want, even if it means enduring a couple painful seasons of losing baseball. Now let's talk about what comes next, because the Donovan trade is almost certainly happening, and the return could determine whether this entire rebuild succeeds or fails. Bloom keeps talking about demanding a high price for Donovan, about not settling for mediocre prospects just to complete a deal, about understanding that Donovan's combination of ability, versatility, and team control makes him extremely valuable. The question is whether he can actually extract that high price from teams like the Giants, Mariners, or Red Sox, or whether he'll face similar market constraints to what he encountered with Arenado. The early indications are actually pretty encouraging. Multiple teams are actively pursuing Donovan, which creates competition and drives up prices. His remaining years of control mean teams aren't just renting him for one season. They're acquiring a potential core piece for multiple years, which justifies paying a premium. And his versatility means he fits organizational needs for teams with multiple roster weaknesses, making him more attractive than single-position alternatives. If Bloom can land a top 100 prospect, or maybe even multiple quality prospects in the 60 to 100 range, the Donovan trade could represent the centerpiece return of this entire rebuild, the acquisition that Cardinals fans point to years from now as the moment things turned around. Combined with the prospects acquired for Gray, Contreras, and Arenado, the farm system would suddenly look legitimately strong, capable of producing multiple big league contributors over the next few years, while Weatherholt and other high-ceiling prospects continue developing in the minor leagues. The timing of all these moves is actually quite brilliant when you step back and look at the bigger picture. The Cardinals are tearing everything down right as their best prospects are close to ready, meaning the rebuild timeline should be relatively short compared to teams that strip their roster before their farm system is prepared to contribute. Weatherholt could potentially debut sometime in the upcoming season. Other prospects acquired in these trades will develop simultaneously, and by the time the Cardinals are ready to start spending money again on free agents, they'll have a young core already in place that can be supplemented with veteran talent rather than built entirely through expensive acquisitions. This is modern rebuild strategy at its finest, and it requires ownership willing to eat salary in the short term, front office executives willing to make unpopular decisions, and fans willing to trust the process even when it feels painful. The DeWitts are providing the financial support. Bloom is making the tough calls, and Cardinals fans need to decide whether they're willing to embrace this vision or whether they're going to spend the next 2 years complaining about losing while the foundation for future success gets built. The Arenado trade looked terrible until you understood the market context, until you realized that the alternatives were even worse, until you recognized that Bloom extracted the best available deal from an impossible situation. The Donovan trade might look underwhelming when it happens, or it might exceed expectations and become the defining move of this entire transition period. Either way, judging these trades requires understanding the broader context, recognizing the constraints that front offices face, and evaluating outcomes based on realistic alternatives rather than fantasy scenarios that were never actually possible. What we're watching right now is organizational transformation in real time. The Cardinals are burning down the old structure and building something new, something that could dominate the National League for the next decade if everything breaks right. The DeWitts deserve credit for funding this properly. Bloom deserves credit for executing it boldly, and Cardinals fans deserve to see this pay off with championships in the not-too-distant future. So here's what we need from you. Get down in the comments right now and tell us whether you think the DeWitts actually deserve more respect for how they're handling this rebuild, whether you think the $54 million investment changes your perspective on ownership's commitment, and what kind of return you're hoping to see when Brendan Donovan inevitably gets traded. Are you Team Bloom, trusting the process and believing these moves will pay off, or are you still skeptical that this front office knows what they're doing? And most importantly, where do you want to see Donovan land, and what prospects should the Cardinals be targeting in return? This conversation is just getting started, and we want to hear every opinion, every hot take, and every prediction you've got. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Cardinals rebuild and want to stay updated on every development as this situation continues evolving, you absolutely need to smash that subscribe button right now. We're going to be covering every trade rumor, every prospect update, and every front office decision as pitchers and catchers report in about a month and this team starts taking shape. Hit that like button if you found this analysis valuable, and make sure your notifications are turned on so you don't miss a single update. The Cardinals offseason is far from over, and things are about to get even more interesting. We'll see you in the next one.
Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button right now.